Hi there, this is James, and I'm a producer on Please Leave and the co-host of the Please Leave Patreon, and I've got a couple of quick announcements. For those of you who are new to the podcast, each week on our Patreon, Courtney and I discuss the inspiration for the main feed episodes, as well as the best horror we've come across recently. Last week, we assigned each other a movie to watch, and this week, you can hear us discuss our picks. I assigned Courtney the Criterion David Lynch classic Fire Walk With Me, and hers was the overlooked web horror The Den. Sign up for our Patreon to join the discussion and celebrate all things horror. Also, we will be at the Overlook Film Festival in New Orleans March 30th through April 2nd, so shoot us a message if you're around and want to meet up. See you then.
Welcome to Please Leave Podcast, where you'll hear truly scary stories that you cannot get out of your head. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence or explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
My mind produced the most perfect nightmare when I was 18 years old. It felt like my brain had conspired against me in such an impeccable way. It was actually funny after the fact. I need to give you a little backstory to explain real quick. I graduated from high school in 2002, and there weren't a lot of opportunities for a girl with limited means who was from the Midwest to branch out and move to other parts of the country, especially exotic places like New York or California. I had the very good fortune to learn about a new program called AmeriCorps that was a sort of domestic Peace Corps, and one of the campuses for the program was in San Diego, California. Long story short, in lieu of starting college right away, I applied, got accepted, and was assigned to live on the San Diego campus, which was an absolute dream come true for a young person trying to escape. There's no way to describe how life-changing it was to move to California at 18 and live with 350 other like-minded people. But I have never felt that kind of magic before and don't think I ever will again. Leaving my isolated, bigoted Midwestern town and then landing in a beachside city surrounded by hundreds of weirdos just like me felt like breathing for the first time. And every day was more exciting and inspiring than the last. We worked up and down the West Coast, and so I also got to travel and see places and have experiences within just a couple of months that I never thought I'd have in my entire life. And then my brain came up with the immaculate nightmare. When I was in high school, they showed a 15-minute news broadcast called Channel 1 in every classroom every day after lunch. When I was a senior, it aired during my least favorite class, which was math. And I always took the opportunity to take a 15-minute nap while a young Lisa Ling and Anderson Cooper shared the news in a hip way that was supposed to speak to teens on their level, or whatever the point of Channel 1 was. So in this nightmare, I woke up from my 15-minute nap in math class during my senior year in high school, and my move to California to be in AmeriCorps had all been a dream. The fact that my subconscious knew that the worst thing that could have happened to me at that point in my life was that I would have woken up in math class to learn that the last few blissful months of my life had all been a dream was so deranged I still can't help but laugh. In the nightmare, I turned to a classmate to tell them about the wonderful dream I'd had, that I'd moved to the West Coast and was traveling around with a team of weirdos that I was totally in love with and doing amazing things, and I was so sad. It was physically painful. And then I woke up for real. I woke up back in California, surrounded by my new friends and adventures, and the relief was unlike just about anything I've ever felt. It hadn't been a dream, and I was still free to be happy and find myself and resume the glorious new life I'd started in paradise. And I did just that. I spent 2 years in AmeriCorps, and during that time, I made some of the most important friends in my life and learned some of the most invaluable lessons. I also learned that I'm not built for manual labor long term, so I enrolled in college in the redwoods of Northern California. Originally, I'd planned to study English to become an English teacher, but at the last minute, I decided to study art because I was paying for my own education, so I could do whatever I wanted with it. And I wanted to learn to paint. And I was unbelievably surprised to find that I was good at it. Like, really, really good at it. Undergrad was a blur because I spent any time that I wasn't in class or at my job in my studio painting. I socialized just enough that I didn't turn into a total weirdo, but 75% of my time was spent holed up in my studio, playing my new favorite MP3 at top volume and pouring whatever was in my soul out and onto the canvas. After winning every award at my school and showing at every exhibition within a 200-mile radius, my favorite professor helped me put together my portfolio so that I could apply to graduate school. I immediately got accepted into my second and third choices. And when the envelope came from the Royal College of Art in London, I left it on my dining room table for a week because I was too scared to open it. Eventually, I felt like my own nerves were going to kill me, and so one day, without thinking, I ripped open the envelope with shaking hands and then opened my letter to reveal that all of my dreams were coming true. I got in. The next few months were a whirlwind of securing housing and selling everything I owned and making all of the necessary plans to move 5,000 miles away and take a massive step toward fulfilling my dreams to become a famous artist. Or at least to make a living as an artist. I spent a couple of weeks at home that summer right before I was scheduled to leave, and my family threw me a huge goodbye party. My usually stoic father gave a toast to express just how proud my parents were of their little girl. And even though I'd worked so hard to get out of my small hometown, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the person it had made me. And to say that I was excited was an understatement. I was ready to live in that massive city and be challenged in ways I'd never been challenged, and to walk in the footsteps of some of my idols. I'd purchased a ticket to fly out of Chicago, and the day before I was supposed to leave, I woke up. When I woke up, I was in my car, in the parking lot of the part-time retail job I'd had to help me pay for things while I was in college. The job had started at 3 p.m., and so I'd always snuck in a nap in my car between class and work, and when I woke up the first time, that's what I woke up to. I'd hated that job. If you've never worked retail, consider yourself lucky, because every shift is a slow and torturous walk between shelves of clothes you've already folded 5 times, customers who definitely do not want your help, and the dressing room where the majority of people make it clear that they are inherently lazy and selfish by leaving clothes in a rumpled heap for sales associates to sort out once they've left. I was grateful for that job because we sold designer clothes, and so there was a small commission on sales that really helped out with my college expenses, but it was a special kind of savagery that I was happy to leave behind. And then suddenly, I was back. I was back in the parking lot of the place I hated, and my boss was knocking on my window to wake me up and signaling with her watch that I was going to be late. One minute, I was on the verge of moving to a new country to find myself, and the next minute, I was about to start another inhumane trek around and around the brightly lit store, and my stomach heaved with sadness and disappointment. But then I remembered the first nightmare, the one where I'd thought my life in California had been a dream, but it hadn't. And so there were a couple of hopeful moments where I sat in my car and willed myself to wake up and be back in my bed on the morning that I was scheduled to move to London to pursue my dreams. I pinched my skin until welts started to form. I slapped the sides of my face, but there was no ecstatic moment when I woke up from this nightmare. And the longer I sat, the more it sunk in that I was definitely awake. I pulled down my sun visor to check my reflection in the mirror, And I had the awful bob haircut I'd decided to give myself toward the end of college, and then had to grow out for the rest of the summer before my move. This was real life. And somehow I was back at a point in my life that I didn't want to be. And here's the strange part. The life that I woke up to in my car that day was definitely my life. But it was a different version of it. I had all of the memories from the life that I woke up in, but I also had all of the memories of the previous version of my life. Both lives were similar, but in the new version in my life, I had made different choices, and so was following a different path. In my alternate life, I had decided at the last minute to study art instead of English. But in the new version of my life, I had followed the original plan to study English. In the new version of my life, I wasn't waking up to take a flight to London. I had stayed in Northern California for the summer to work the retail job while I waited for school to start in the fall. In my new life, I was 2 months away from starting my first year as a 7th grade English teacher. And to say I was devastated by the shift was an understatement. As I sat in my car, it all seemed to come to me. All of the details of my new life came into focus, but I could still remember the old life somehow. The life where I was an artist instead of an English teacher, and I was filled with inspiration and excitement about my future, instead of a dull sense of dread about starting school as a newbie educator. All of the details of my new life downloaded into my brain as I sat in my car in the hot afternoon sun, and I spent the last few minutes before my shift was scheduled to start sobbing in the parking lot in front of the line of upscale storefronts. Somehow, I was able to pull myself together enough to dry off my face and drag myself to work. But I felt completely disassociated from myself as I pretended to interact with my coworkers and customers like it was just another day in the world of retail. I should have called into work, but the thought of facing my new reality at home alone was even scarier than pretending that everything was okay. And so I tried my best to smile and be professional despite feeling totally disassociated from myself. The best way that I can describe it is the feeling when you accidentally nap way longer than you meant to, and when you wake up, it's suddenly night instead of day, and you feel groggy and out of sorts because you slept too hard, and you also know you're going to be up way too late as a result. It felt like that, but mingled with unending confusion and grief. There was no one I could talk to about my loss. No doctor I could see to help me understand why I had memories of the life I was living, but also of a whole other life that I'd lived. I just had to accept that it had been some sort of cruel, extended dream and move on. But the weight of the loss of the last life weighed me down for months. I'd spent so much time envisioning my whitewashed, loft-style art studio. I'd spent hours thrifting interesting outfits to wear to events. I'd taken up smoking because I naively thought that my peers in London would accept me more if I did. I was so ready for that life, and to have it snatched away was indescribable. I knew it must have been a long, elaborate dream, but it didn't feel like a dream at all. It felt like memories. It felt so real and so tangible, and I was so depressed and confused that it was gone. It took me a very long time to feel like myself again. But eventually I did. School started, and I actually really enjoyed teaching. My students were unruly preteens with unreliable hormones, angsty attitudes, and terrible hygiene. And I couldn't get enough of them. I'm sure it helped that I was all of those things at their age, and so rather than trying to suppress their unsavory natures, I leaned in and encouraged and commiserated. I was more of their partner in crime than their authority figure, and the approach really worked. Rather than jamming grammar and literature down their throats, I led them through the various corridors of the English language and let them choose which doors they wanted to open. English has rules, but it's also completely lawless. And my renegade approach helped the kids find their voices and new outlets for expressing themselves, which is ultimately the only thing most teenagers want: to be seen and heard and guided but not constrained. I continued to work the retail job in the summer because they offered me a pretty substantial commission structure after a couple of years, and so I was able to set aside quite a bit of money and had plans to buy a house in the next year. And while it wasn't the glamorous life I'd envisioned for myself as an artist, it was still very fulfilling. And I was happy. And then I woke up. I had been teaching for 3 years and had just learned that one of my star students and I had been selected to spend a summer in Munich the following year as a part of a special student-teacher exchange program. My student was a kid named Daryl, and he was being raised by a single mother who had really struggled to make ends meet. Daryl had really blossomed in the year that he'd been in my class. He had a tremendous way with words, and while his mother loved him and was very supportive of his newfound talents, she didn't have the means to give him additional opportunities to explore his gifts. So it was a big deal when our school partnered with a private school in Munich to set up the exchange, and Daryl and I had been selected. I knew he would meet people that could change his life forever, and I was also excited for the change of scenery. And then a week before we were scheduled to leave, I woke up in that fucking parking lot again. I had kept the retail job in the summers because the money was so good, but I had let them know that I was leaving for the exchange, and so wasn't sure if I would be back the following summer because I wanted to leave my options open. So there was no reason for me to be napping in the parking lot in front of the store like I had in the past. But there I was, waking up in the hot sun a couple 100 feet away from the front door of my soul-crushing part-time employer. And speaking of soul-crushing, when I woke up the second time, I wasn't a teacher. As I fully came to in my muggy car, I almost wailed in agony as my new circumstances formed as unwelcome vignettes in my mind. During the summer before I'd started teaching, the store had offered me a district manager position, which included benefits and a sizable bump in my commission. It wouldn't have meant a ton of extra money to start, but there would be opportunity for more growth down the road as the company had just been purchased by a much larger retail conglomerate. In my previous life, I had turned down the offer because I had just been hired to teach the 7th graders. But as my new reality passed through me in a thick and painful wave, I knew that in this new life, I had accepted the management position. I stared down at the steering wheel that I was clutching with both hands until my knuckles were covered in white and pink splotches, and the unmistakable Lexus logo shined back at me from in between them. In my previous life, I had driven a 14-year-old Honda that I'd inherited when my aunt had died. But in this life, my pants slid across buttery leather when I shifted in my seat. I shot daggers toward the entrance to the store and then slammed my fists against the Lexus as I cursed my past self for choosing this path. My eyes filled with tears, and I thought about Daryl and my other students and my cozy classroom covered in poems and hip-hop lyrics and movie quotes that we'd collected over the 3 sweet years that I'd taught those willful teens. And my heart shattered as I realized that there was no way back to them, if they even existed at all. I took several deep breaths in my new-smelling car and ran my hands back and forth over the expensive pants as I tried to fathom how I was going to face the atrocious career that some version of me had chosen. Maybe it's not that bad, I said out loud to psych myself up to start my shift. and then grabbed my stylish work bag, threw open the car door, and forced my feet to carry me across the parking lot and into a life that I had not chosen. And it was bad. I did not like that life, not one bit. I was good at the job and had always had a knack for sales and merchandising, so I made very decent money, but I was not happy. Not happy at all. There were the occasional perks, like directors' conventions in Palm Springs, mindless trainings in Las Vegas, and quarterly fancy luncheons, but the day-to-day was torture. I missed my students, and I longed to make a difference again. I missed engaging young minds and sharing things that had changed my life at their age. I missed happy hours with the other educators and extended holidays and the infectious feeling of future and possibility that comes from spending time with young people. I missed their slang and music and jokes and the sly ways they let me in on their secrets without actually letting me know that they liked me. And the most excruciating part was that I was too scared to do it again. I still had my degree and teaching license in the new life, but I was too scared to search for jobs because I didn't know if I would wake up again and it would all be gone. I was terrified to look for my students, only to have their faces register me as a stranger. My heart couldn't take it. I spent hours on the internet trying to figure out if there was a condition that caused people to have overactive dreams that were so vivid they felt like real life. But all I could find were typical cases of schizophrenia and psychosis. And I was sure that what was happening to me wasn't that. It all felt very real and simultaneously like the same life, but not at all. I didn't think I was making it all up, but it didn't make any logical sense, and I didn't know how to make it stop. And it's sad, but I was too scared to face the disappointment of the first two jumps. And so I stayed the course and remained in a tedious but lucrative position as a district manager for a luxury retail company. Most days were a bitter reproduction of the day before, where I got up, worked out for an hour, packed my lunch, did my job, then went home and drank too much wine to further numb my already numb existence. Sometimes I'd go out for drinks with coworkers and feign interest in whatever insipid thing they brought up to talk about, while I forced myself to stay present and not wander back to memories of the previous lives. Because they didn't exist. Or at least I continued to tell myself that. But just like all memories, over time, the ones that I had of the previous lives faded further and further away. And after 2 years, I was fully resigned to and consumed by my dull new reality. I was so resigned and removed, in fact, that when I met him at the bar after my coworkers had gone home one evening, it didn't cross my mind that talking to him might be a bad idea. His name was Ben. His brown eyes and his voice were as disarming as his sweet name, and so before I knew it, we'd shut down the bar while we slowly nursed our drinks and chatted like we'd known each other our entire lives. And I was so intoxicated by the sensation of looking forward to something for the first time in so many years that I gave him my number when he asked, and then met him for dinner a week later, and a week after that, and a week after that. Ben was an environmental lawyer and a good guy. He was as funny as he was kind, as he was smart. He was adventurous and woke me out of my retail stupor, and we took trips to the places I dreamed of in that life, and the repressed past lives as well. For the first several months, I was definitely scared to go to sleep every night. There's no doubt about it. Not only was I happy for the first time in a very long time, but I was happier than I'd ever been in any of my lives. And I was terrified to wake up in that parking lot with the heavy feeling of dread and recognition that fate had found me once again and dragged me from one reality to another. But a month passed, and then 2, and then 10, and every time I opened my eyes, I was right where I wanted to be. And Ben was there next to me. So by the time he asked me to marry him, I felt confident that he was here to stay, literally and metaphysically. And so I said yes. We had a stunning wedding on the coast and bought a refurbished farm home in our favorite part of town to start our new life together. The internet had given me new access to information about my brain and my strange past, and by the time Ben and I had been married for a year, I'd convinced myself that the first 2 lives had been the result of stress-related hallucinations. I learned that some people can have really extreme reactions to stress, and college in my early 20s had been fraught with fear and uncertainty. It would make sense that once I took the retail job, fell into a consistent routine, and my stress level was more manageable, that I'd stopped having the extended dreams or hallucinations of the lives I'd never lived. This was my life. It always had been. And I was finally living it to its fullest. A year after we got married, I gave birth to our first daughter, Lily, and my life was completely transformed in that moment. I had never experienced anything remotely similar to the feelings of love and fulfillment that crashed down on me, threatening to crush me and break me into dust as I laid eyes on her for the first time. I swear she came out smiling, and she was a perfect little cherub with her father's dark hair and my green eyes. Everything about her was soft and serene, and she was such a joy to be around. Everyone said so. Her sassy little sister showed up a year after that to complete my sweet set of Irish twins. We named her Jane, and she was so feisty and funny and unique. She was entertaining us from the moment she opened her eyes, and Lily absolutely worshipped her and never let her little sister out of her sight. I had finally quit my job before I had Lily because I knew I wanted to stay home with them. And once they were here, I couldn't fathom spending entire days away from my little human masterpieces. Ben had taken on some corporate consulting gigs, so we had more than enough money, and spending my days with my girls was euphoric. The climate in northeastern California allowed us to spend tons of time outside, and the girls loved to dig for worms and chase each other around the yard while I worked on our terraced backyard garden. On other days, we would take long walks to the library and stop for a fresh-baked treat on the way home. As soon as she could talk, Lily would insist that we bring one home for Ben, too. She was such a kind and considerate soul. We decided to get Lily a dog for her 4th birthday, and I think I was more excited about the prospect of a furry new member of the family than she was going to be. I had always had dogs as a kid, but hadn't had the time to manage one as an adult, and I was giddy to round out our perfect family with the floppy cuddles and unconditional love that you can only get from dogs. Ben and I went to the local shelter a week before Lily's birthday and found the most gorgeous, curly, mid-sized mutt of a thing. If I had to guess, I would say he was part Portuguese water dog, part Muppet. And I fell in love instantly as I buried my face in his massive mop of a head, and he wiggled free to give me a series of sloppy kisses. The girls were going to be beside themselves, and I couldn't wait to see their faces when they met Jules, which is the name Lily always insisted she'd give her first pet. Ben and I arranged to pick up the pup on the afternoon of Lily's birthday, right before the party we'd arranged to have in our backyard. I spent the next few days sprucing up the patio with lights and fresh cushions, and I could hardly fall asleep on the night before the big day. I was so excited. I couldn't wait to see their smiles and hear their squeals, and for all of us to have another being in the house to feel grateful for. And then I woke up. I woke up back in my Lexus, in my $300 pants, surrounded by my leather interior in that godforsaken parking lot in front of that store. That fucking store. When I woke up this time, I sucked in an enormous breath like someone who had just survived drowning and then let out the most primal of screams that must have originated at the first point of human existence and spanned all generations until it found me in that parking lot and entered my body with the message that I was once again lost. But this time, my babies were gone too. I screamed, and I screamed, and I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, and I pulled at my hair and ripped my blouse, and then screamed some more. Once I had screamed so long my entire body was vibrating from the release, I turned over the contents of my purse and clawed my way through them until I found my keys. It's not too late, I told myself, and didn't recognize the raw and desperate voice that came out of my body. Just go home. They'll still be there. I repeated this hopeless prayer as I turned on the car, threw it into drive, and raced out of the parking lot with a screech of burning rubber. I blew through every stop sign and traffic light between the store and my house, and the 10 minutes it took to get there were the longest of my entire life. As I pulled up to the house, I didn't take the time to maneuver into the driveway. Instead, pulled up and into the front yard, left the car running, and sprinted to the front door. I could tell by the direction of the sun and the contented way the neighbors were walking to their cars with coffees in hand that it was probably around 8 or 9 in the morning, so the girls were usually eating their breakfast or watching cartoons around that time. I tried the front door, but it was locked. So I started slamming my open hand against it and screaming the names of my family at the top of my lungs. I could sense a neighbor pausing to contemplate the scene I was making, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to my family. I needed to confirm that they were still here, or that I was still here in the life that I loved more than anything that had ever existed or would ever exist. It's impossible to describe the infinite nature of that type of love and longing. But as I pounded and wailed on my front porch that morning, it became clear to me that it is the most powerful force in the universe. It is also the most destructive. After what was probably about 30 seconds, but felt like a lifetime and a half, I heard the lock to the deadbolt shifting in the doorframe, so I stepped back and held my breath. It took another eternity for the door to swing open, and when it finally did, a middle-aged woman that I had never seen before in my life appeared on the other side. "Can I help you?" she asked with a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Who are you?" I asked as the bottom fell out from under me. "Where is Ben? Where are my girls?" I started to push into the house, but the woman instinctively blocked me with her body and called out, "David, help!" She tried her best to keep me at bay, but I was becoming more feral every minute that I was separated from my daughters. I clawed and slapped and pushed her until I'd broken through, and I launched myself down the short hallway and into the living room where I could usually find my girls snuggled up in the morning. "Hey!" a large man called as he came barreling down the stairs to see what was going on. "What the hell? Who are you?" The woman joined him by his side and gently swiped at a bloody scratch I'd planted on her cheek. "Where are my girls?" I screamed at them with all of my might. I frantically turned in circles to scan the room, and as I turned, it registered that I didn't recognize a single thing in the room. I had never seen the sofa before, or the credenza, or the throw pillow, or the light fixture, or the rug. I could see the man and woman inching closer toward me, their hands out in front of them with their palms up to keep me back, but to also try to calm me. Before they could reach me, I rushed into the empty kitchen, then through the back door and into the empty backyard. Even though I knew what was happening, and that my beautiful husband and my glorious girls were gone, I couldn't help but search for them, hoping beyond hope that I was wrong, and they would be just around the corner. By the time the police arrived, I had ripped out 3 rows of flowers and plants from the terraced garden, and my throat was raw and bloody from my screams. The police brought me to a psychiatric hospital, and I was there for just over a month. The upside of being there was that I finally learned what is happening to me. While I was in the hospital, I had a roommate named Linda, and I told her everything. It was a relief to finally tell someone about my first 3 lives. I'd never told a soul, because how could I? What would I even say? That I had all of my memories from the life I was currently living, plus all of the memories from the previous and very similar but completely different life? 2 very similar but completely different lives? But once I lost the girls and Ben, I didn't care. I told everyone who came within a 10-foot radius of me what happened to me. I told the police, and then the doctors, and they all said reassuring words, but their eyes were full of a revolting mixture of pity and annoyance. A look that says that they've seen it 1,000 times before, and they have to figure out what to do with me so that I'll be the least disruptive version of myself, and therefore, not their problem. But I kept telling people what happened to me, and finally, mercifully, Linda believed me. And not only did she believe me, she knew exactly what caused these shifts in my life. She knew why I kept losing everything and starting over in the same but simultaneously dissimilar life. Linda explained that there's a machine in Sweden, and that messes with particles, and the government is using it to experiment with our lives. She said they started turning it on in 2008, which is the first year that I woke up in a new life. She said that there are infinite versions of our lives, all running simultaneously and side by side, like a train track that stretches out vertically forever. She said that every time they turn that machine on, we all jump a track or 2, but we're not supposed to know it. She said that if you try real hard, you can will your consciousness to wake up on a new and better track, but you still shouldn't have all of the memories from the previous. You should just start to have a better life because you're on a better track, and then just live happily ever after. But she said that there are some of us who keep all of our memories of every track as we jump. And it's because we are an ancient tribe of aliens who were assimilated on Earth thousands of years ago, and our subconscious are sending us signals to remind us that we don't belong here, so we can find our way home. She lost me after the alien part, but I was so relieved to find out the truth about my life. I hugged her and allowed myself to cry tears of happiness and hope. Hope that I can find my way back to the track where I left my daughters and resume my splendid life. We had a very young and not very bright orderly who worked late nights on the weekends, and I was able to convince him to let me use his phone to research the machine for 5 minutes one night. I learned that they turned the machine on the night that I jumped into this nightmare, and they were scheduled to turn it off again in 8 months. Based on the schedule of times they had turned the machine on and off in the past, it was clear that I didn't jump every time. But I did have a creeping fear that maybe that timeline would be closed to me if I didn't make it back before they turned the machine off this round. I hoped that maybe the channel that sent me here would remain open as long as the machine was running. And somehow, God knows how, I could get back before it closed. So I remained on my best behavior, and every night I chanted the words that Linda had taught me to try to get back to my previous life. Every night as I went to sleep, I said, I intend to wake up on my best possible timeline. And every morning before I opened my eyes, I said, I am on my best possible timeline. But every morning I woke up in the hard bed under the rough sheet in the hospital. I continued the mantra once they released me and I was back home, but it didn't work then either. I spent so many hours researching how to switch timelines, I was barely sleeping. I would nod off at my computer for a bit, and when I woke up, I would jump back in. I corresponded with people I met on message boards. I gave my credit card number to countless gurus and metaphysical experts who claimed they could help me find my way back. But I just continued the endless cycle of sleeping for a couple of minutes or hours at a time in between my research and the occasional meal. And every time I woke up, I was still here. The pain was so great from being so far away from my family that I don't know how I endured. It was excruciating. After 6 months of trying and failing to get back to my old life, I came up with a new plan. I decided that I need to find them here. If they existed on that timeline, they must exist here too, right? Can there be a timeline where they don't exist because Ben and I don't meet, and so the girls were never born, or is that impossible? It doesn't make sense that they would simultaneously exist and not exist, and so I decided to find them. Or find Ben and make them again. Once I had the new plan, I was able to live more like a normal person, because I knew it was important to be the woman they needed me to be. I cleaned myself up, got my old job at that awful store, and started my hunt for Ben. It only took a couple of minutes of Googling to find him in Southern California. Ben was originally from the southern part of the state, so my guess was that on this timeline, he'd never taken the job that had moved him north. I started crying when a photo of his face popped up when I clicked on his new employer. I was so relieved to see him, and so excited to reunite with my lost love. I paid $1.99 to do a public record search on him, and my excitement was demolished a moment later. His address and phone number came up first, and when I scrolled down a couple of lines, I saw the word that sent my hopes spiraling away from me down a dark corridor where so many things I'd loved in my life had ended up. Ben was married, and so he was no longer mine. Not without a fight, anyway. And I only had so much fight left in me. But my girls were too important, and so before my hope was gone completely, I snapped myself out of it and made a new plan. I could live without Ben. I would miss him so much, but I could physically live without that love. I knew I couldn't go on living without my girls. And so as long as I could get them back, I could be okay. I didn't need to marry Ben. I just needed to make my babies with him again. So I started to make a plan to do just that. At first, I started to hatch a plan to fly to Southern California and stalk and seduce Ben. But the logistics and morality of the whole thing were immediately overwhelming. I was in the process of psyching myself up to fly down the coast and take advantage of the love of my life when I suddenly had an epiphany, and it simplified everything considerably. The memory of my first date with Ben came rushing back, and specifically, one of the first things he'd said to me after we'd sat down. Ben was such a good and moral person. He said he didn't want to let things go any further without telling me something first. He admitted that he'd been so broke in college that he'd donated sperm a couple of times, and that he'd dated women in the past who thought that that was a real deal breaker. He wanted to let me know up front so that he didn't waste my time. And a huge smile passed over his face when I immediately responded that it didn't bother me at all. At that point in that life, I was still barely living. And I was just passing time managing retail workers and drinking wine. I'd gone out with Ben to enjoy a break in the monotony, and I wouldn't have cared if he'd told me he'd murdered someone. I just needed to enjoy something for a couple of hours, and so I dismissed his concern and had basically forgotten about it until it came flooding back. Luckily, there were only 3 sperm banks in the vicinity of Ben's alma mater, and they were all happy to have me as a client as long as I paid their fees. I signed up for all 3 by the end of the month, and then I started searching for Ben. It took all day because filtering for white men with brown eyes and brown hair didn't cut the options down too greatly. But I found him in the second database I searched, his sweetness radiating from the page the moment I opened it. I took a moment to mourn the love we shared, and then picked up my phone to call the center and make all of the necessary arrangements to create my eldest daughter for the second time. I am as fertile on this timeline as I was on the last, and Lily implanted on the first round, like the good girl she is. I wailed another primal wail when my pregnancy test came back positive. But this time I was crying with a mixture of love and relief and cried and cried. I cried the cries that mothers have been crying for centuries as they love and protect and hurt and heal and long for and reject and reunite with the humans that they've created. I cried that cry, and then I waited for my girl to return to me. The mother that loved her so much that I spanned literal time and space to bring her back to me. And just 9 months later, our reunion date arrived. I was talking to her this morning, warm and safe inside of my midsection like I did every morning since I'd learned she was coming. I'd told her all of the stories that I could remember from her first life, and all that she had to look forward to when she returned. I was in the middle of a story about the first Christmas after Jane was born when a sharp pain ripped through my abdomen and sent me to my knees. Once the contraction had passed, I tried to stand up to walk to my car or call for help, but just as soon as I was standing, I collapsed again as my own muscles attacked me in a series of excruciating spasms. The contractions came in a steady series of unending waves. I barely had time to catch my breath before I was doubled over in another, and I knew that there was no time to go to the hospital. Even if I had my phone, I doubted I'd be able to call. The pain was so persistent and violent. I'd heard that a woman's body will have much shorter labor the more kids she has, but this felt brutal and unnatural, and I didn't have a choice but to ride the powerful waves my body produced and try to breathe. I'm not sure how long I endured the vicious contractions, but eventually my body told me it was time to push, and 20 minutes later, she was here. My miracle baby was here. And I love her. I love her even more than I did the first time. And I will protect her from the world. The world that won't understand my baby that denied the rules of the universe and navigated the impossible to be mine again. The baby that never stopped screaming from what she survived on the way to find me. The baby that wasn't supposed to exist on this timeline and so doesn't have the perfect skin and rosy lips and round eyes that other babies do. My baby was ripped through the cosmos by her mother's love, and her face and body bear the scars of that ferocious devotion. Her skin reformed into grotesque ribbons of flesh in various stages of oozing and healing, surrounded by air she was never supposed to breathe. Her unseeing eyes are pure white from overuse and from perceiving the imperceptible. To stare into them is to take a glimpse into forever. Her lips are skewed in a forever snarl encircling too many tiny, jagged teeth. They emerge from her gums in ways that will never aid in her nourishment, but will serve as a reminder of how she is one of a kind. My miracle. Her tiny body has lived endlessly. She has fractured into infinite particles and come back together again on the other side of time. More monster than human. But she is my baby. I have my sweet Lily back. And in 2 years, we will be reunited with our sassy Jane. And everything will be just like it was before.
This story was written by Courtney Eck and narrated by Kaye Weaver. For more scary stories that you cannot get out of your head, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/PleaseLeavePod. Please follow Please Leave on Facebook and Instagram at PleaseLeavePod. Our email is pleaseleavepod@gmail.com, and our website is pleaseleavepod.com. If you like this story, please take a second to give us a review or a rating. It's just a couple of us trying to get this thing off the ground, so your support really helps us. This has been a Two Penguins Media production.
Quack.